This is the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and reflexes lab. So I'm going to go over the models that we have regarding these areas, have this form out that you see now, the lab parts to know. We'll try to go in order, but it's going to be a little bit out of order because I'm going to look at some microscope slides as well. So we'll start with the spinal cord lengthwise. Now on the torso model, you can see the spinal cord there in yellow, going all the way up from the brain stem down to its ending. Now this whole thing is called the spinal cord, but the true cord part that looks like a electrical cord wrapped up goes from C1 down to about L1 here, or L2, and then it fans out with these nerves coming off the spinal cord. And of course, nerves are coming off the spinal cord all the way down. So that's the spinal cord. Now let's go over the ending part. So again, the cord, you can see it's nice, it has nerves, spinal nerves coming off, comes down here, and then you can see the cord. This is about the lumbar area. Cord kind of ends right there, and then you have all these nerves fanning out like a horse's tail. And that's how they got a name of some of these structures there. So on your list, where the cord ends, we call the conus medullaris, right there. And then we have the cauda equina, is all these nerves coming off the tail end of the cord. And they fan on down here into the lumbar and sacral area. All that's the cauda equina. Cauda means tail, equina means horse. And then the other structure to notice is, if you look closely, you'll see a fibrous piece that goes all the way down and attaches to the coccyx right here, right in the middle. That's called the filum terminale. And that's actually a strong fibrous structure made of the pia mater that's going to anchor the spinal cord so it doesn't wind up and stays taut. Filum terminale, right there. Okay, terminal fiber. Now if we go over and look at this model here, this is called the flat man model. We can see some of these structures here too. Spinal cord all the way down. This is the conus medullaris here, the white where it ends. All this is cauda equina, and you can see the nice filum terminale here. Gonna hook on the coccyx tailbone. All right, now we move to our list, and we're gonna go over the spinal cord coverings. Now let's look at this cross section of the spinal cord here. Of course, we have the vertebra around it. Okay, that's the bone. And this is the body, the vertebra. Spinous process on the dorsal. Now, under the vertebra, we have some fat. And that's called the epidural fat, because it's going to be sitting on top of these three meninges. And if you remember, the top layer of the meninges here is called the dura mater. It's a tough, fibrous layer. And since this fat sits on top, and epi means on top, that's the epidural fat layer. Often anesthetics, if we need to numb up the spinal cord, like for labor and delivery or other reasons, we can inject an anesthetic in that fat, which will seep down into the spinal cord and numb up any structures below that. But anyway, that's the dura mater of the meninges here. Then we have the arachnoid mater after that. And then under the arachnoid mater, we have this space. It's called the subarachnoid space because sub means under, just like a submarine is under the water. Submarine. But this is subarachnoid. And that has cerebral spinal fluid in it. Also has lots of fibers sticking down, which aren't shown on this model. but that's where it's got its name arachnoid, which means spider. It looks like a spider web in real life. And then the subarachnoid space, and then on top of the spinal cord itself, we have the pia mater, thin meninges there. I think we can see it on this model too. If we look straight down, this is showing the vertebra. And if we look straight down, you can see the nerves coming off the spinal cord in the middle. And let's see what we can see here now. Dura mater, arachnoid mater with subarachnoid space. This color here, it looks like dark gray, is the pia mater. Very good. This model, they do show some of the maters, but we can't distinguish all the layers there, but we can still see the maters around the spinal cord. Now we move to the spinal cord cross section. And the first thing we want to do is distinguish between the gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the internal part of the spinal cord. We had gray matter and white matter in the brain. In the brain, the gray matter made up the cortex, the outer part, and the white matter made up the inner part of the brain. In the spinal cord, it's reversed. White matter is on the outside. Now remember, that's the myelinated axons of the neurons, and the gray matter is the cell bodies of the neurons. So in this gray matter, these extensions here are called horns. So the one that goes all the way up to the dorsal of the spinal cord is the dorsal horn. And it looks the most like a horn. It goes all the way up. We know that's dorsal too because, remember, the spinous process of the vertebra is there. Then we have a lateral horn here, and we have a ventral horn here. This is also a gray matter coming across. And within that gray matter in the central area is a canal. That's the central canal of the spinal cord, which also has cerebral spinal fluid in it. And this gray matter connecting the two sides with the central canal in the middle, that's called the gray commissure. Commissure means connect. On this side, dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn of the gray matter. The white matter areas are called funiculi, so one's called a funiculus. Now, instead of using dorsal and ventral, they use posterior and anterior, which you remember, posterior means dorsal, anterior means ventral. So this funiculus here, of white matter, is the posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculus. For the grooves and spaces, we already said the central canal here. And then this little groove here is the posterior median sulcus, and this is the anterior median fissure. Fissure is a little bit wider, that's why they called it a fissure instead of a sulcus. But again, you can tell this is a posterior because dorsal horn, spinous process. All right, now what else we can see here is the spinal nerve and the spinal nerve roots. Go back up a little bit. The spinal roots we'll go over first because you can see they are directly connected to the spinal column. You can see one here and one here. Think of them as little rootlets. And this is the dorsal one, and this is the ventral one. Now, the dorsal root carries all the sensory neurons into the spinal cord. So we can call that the dorsal sensory root. And all the motor neurons coming out and going to our muscles are called motor neurons. So that's the motor root. And since it's ventral, we can call it the ventral motor root. Now the dorsal root has this big swelling here of cell bodies, and that's called a ganglion. And only the dorsal root has that. So this is called the dorsal root ganglion. And that's another way of telling that we're on the dorsal side, the dorsal root ganglion there of the sensory nerve roots. Now then there's the ventral motor root where they combined and exit the vertebral column, the bones. That's the spinal nerve right here. It's a very short segment actually, because where those two roots, dorsal and ventral root, combine, they combine just so they can exit the vertebral column. And then they're going to branch out again. Here, you can kind of see that they're going to come together as roots, and then they're going to exit out here. And then split up again. Let's look at another model, several models to make sure you're getting this down. Here's another good one. Here. So let's look at the gray matter and white matter. You can tell this is the dorsal horn, ventral horn, lateral horn. Not much the lateral horn on this one. This is the gray matter. Posterior funiculi, lateral funiculi, anterior funiculi. Gray commissure around the central canal. Posterior median sulcus, anterior median fissure. Here we see the roots coming off. Let's just concentrate on this one for now. Okay, so we know this is the dorsal sensory root because it leads to the dorsal horn and it has the dorsal root ganglion. This is the ventral motor roots. And notice where they combine here. That's the spinal nerve. There. That's going to branch again. We come out here. When it branches again, we're going to call those branches as rami. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Same on this side. Dorsal sensory root, dorsal root ganglion, ventral motor root, combine into the spinal nerve. Let's switch this out. There's another one. They have it kind of labeled here now for you. Let's look at this side here. Dorsal horn. We have the dorsal sensory roots coming out. Yellow and green. You know, and a nerve root is a whole bunch of neurons. That's why they have the different wires there. Some of them they're calling somatic, and some of them they're calling visceral. Visceral, remember, it goes to the organs, whereas somatic goes to more of the body parts, other body parts. So that's coming in, remember? Afferent means coming in. So sensory nerves and neurons coming in from the body and from the organs. Dorsal sensory root, dorsal root ganglion. Ventral motor roots coming out. Looks like they're coming out from the ventral horn and the lateral horn, because some of them are going to the organs. Again, we have ones that are somatic efferent going to the muscles, visceral efferent going to the muscles of the organs. So that's the motor root. They join here, this short section, the spinal nerve. It's a mixed nerve, sensory and motor. It's to enter and exit between the vertebral bones, the vertebrae. Back to this model. Let's see what we can tell on that. I will look straight down again. Okay, now we're going to flip this just so you can see, because I told you those dorsal horns go all the way up. They really have them sticking up like horns on this model. The gray matter is gray on this one. And here's the spinous process. We know that's dorsal there too. Let's see if we can find the dorsal root ganglion. Yeah, there it's also on the dorsal here. Dorsal root ganglion, ventral motor root. There they combine to to form the spinal nerve, which is very short, where it's going to start branching into those rami. Here, short spinal nerve here. Can kind of see as it comes out between the bones here. It's coming out there before it branches again. Okay, let's see if we can see anything on this one. Can't really tell the roots on this particular model. Okay. All right, we have next on your list, we have the spinal cord video, which I want you to watch. It's similar to the fixed brain, except it's a fixed spinal cord by the same lady. Now, the peripheral nerve anatomy, I'm going to wait on that till the end because I have to move to the microscope. So let's move to the spinal nerves and reflexes. The spinal nerves are in 5 groups. And you already learned the vertebral bones, which these are the same there. So if we look at the, let's look at the flat man. We have the cervical spinal nerves coming off the neck area. You can see them coming between the vertebrae. Then we have the thoracic coming out in the chest area. Remember, there's ribs there where the ribs end. But before we get to the hips is the lumbar area, lower back. It's going to be 5 vertebrae there and 5 nerves coming out between the vertebrae. And then, so this is the lumbar area right here, between the ribs and the tip of the pelvic bone. Then we're going to have 5 vertebrae in the sacrum area there. And they're coming out between the foramen of the sacrum. Remember, the sacrum is 5 fused vertebrae. And then down here we have the coccyx there. It's a couple spinal nerves there. They're the same numbers as the bones, except for the cervical area. We have 8 spinal nerves. And the reason here is the first spinal nerve comes out above the first cervical vertebrae. So we have 8 cervical nerves, even though we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Then it just stays the same. We have 12 thoracic spinal nerves, same as the number of thoracic vertebrae. 5 lumbar, between the ribs and the tip of the pelvic bone. And then we have 5 sacral nerves, which is between the pelvic bones, because remember the sacrum makes up the back union of the pelvic bones. And then we have a couple coccygeal nerves. Going off here, that's the filum terminale there, remember? And on here we says 1 coccygeal nerve. Okay. Here you can kind of see the same numbers. Now let's get to the rami, because on your sheet I have the rami is after the spinal nerve comes out, it splits to branch to go to all parts of your body. We need to get sensations in from all parts of your body. We need to send messages to all the motors in all areas of your body. So if we look at this model here, this would be the rami. That would be a dorsal ramus, and this would be a ventral ramus. And after the rami, they're going to split all up into a network, which is going to be called a plexus. On this side, spinal nerve right in here to exit the vertebral column, the vertebral bone, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. If we come to this one that we had, that's the spinal nerve where the roots joined. And then you can see it's splitting into many rami, dorsal ramus, a couple ventral ramus here. here, let's see. This would be the spinal nerve coming out. And then once it's out, it's going to split. So you have a couple rami there, and then you can see it's going to turn into this big plexus here. But let's go over the plexuses. So the plexuses, let me get my sheet back here to make sure I get everything you're supposed to have. All right, we have a cervical plexus branching to the neck, and there's the long branch that's going to go to your diaphragm muscle. The brachial plexus is going to branch to your arms, because remember, brachial means arm. There is no thoracic plexus as such. We're going to see it's mainly intercostal nerves going between the ribs, but then they're going to split off later to go to your anterior and posterior torso muscles. Lumbar plexus we're going to have, and then sacral plexus we're going to have. So let's see a couple of these. All right, our cervical plexus, we can see all these branching areas up here feeding the muscles of the neck, sending sensations from the neck and head into the brain. Some of those are going to be the cranial nerves. We're also going to have up above that we're going to go over. The cervical spinal nerves. There, you can see a bunch of them there. There's 8 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's where the cervical area is. Cervical nerves, and this would be your cervical plexus as they branch. The brachial plexus is going to branch to the arms. Now, part of the brachial plexus actually does start with the cervical nerves. C5 to T1 I have there. So right around in here, and the first one here, we can see how they're branching, and this branching network of nerves is even more complicated than that, of course, is the brachial plexus, and they come down to the arm, to all those muscles you learned in the arm, and all your skin areas of the arm as well. This side, you can see the brachial plexus. Any of these yellow network structures that lead to the arm. We said there's no thoracic plexus because you see they don't really branch out, at least not right away. So all of these spinal nerves turn into intercostal nerves that go between the ribs, and then off of those nerves they will feed the muscles there, pectorals and lats and all those that you learned, and also there's nerve fibers coming in for sensations from those areas. The lumbar plexus, I'm going to start down here, okay, anywhere between the ribs and hips, that's the lumbar plexus right there. And then the sacral plexus is going to be down here between the 2 pelvic bones there. Now I will point out, let's get our sheet again here, that there's going to be a major nerve coming off the lumbar plexus that's going to go to the upper thigh, called the femoral nerve. And I want you to learn this nerve, the sciatic nerve that you've probably heard about, that comes from the sacral plexus, that's going to go down the entire leg to the foot. It's the longest, thickest nerve in the body. So if I show you those, the femoral nerve sits on the femur. So that's why it's called the femoral nerve. That starts up here. See how it comes down and lands on the femur? That's from the lumbar plexus. That's going to lead to most of the muscles there in your thigh, quads, hamstrings, and send in sensations from those areas. But the sciatic nerve here, thick, long, look how long it is, all the way down to your foot. And it's a little bit more medial than the femoral. That's the sciatic. Originates here from the sacral plexus area. That's going to feed a lot of the muscles in the whole leg and the lower leg, calf, anterior tibialis, foot. And if that gets irritated, you have what's called sciatica. It's very painful. Now, when injections are given, I think I covered this in one of the chapters, when injections are given in the buttocks, we got to make sure we avoid hitting this giant sciatic nerve because it'll make the person pass out and they'll probably faint. So we got to make sure when we give an injection, since the sciatic nerve is going to be right coming around in this area, that we give an injection way over here to avoid hitting sciatic or the femoral nerves that are closer and going down about this area. So we give the shot way over here, about right there. The other thing I want to point out, if you notice that the cervical plexus also weirdly sends a branch all the way down to the diaphragm muscle, and that's called the phrenic nerve. They do show the branch on here, but they don't show the cervical coming all the way down. But picture one of these cervical nerves just coming out and coming all the way down here and then branching off to the diaphragm to help us breathe. That's the phrenic nerve. Of course, their breathing is controlled in the neck area. Okay? In the brainstem area, where it feeds into the neck, joins the neck. So that's the phrenic nerve. On this flat man, this would be the phrenic nerve here. Here, femoral on the femur, and there's your giant sciatic. Okay. I just want to point out, when you get to the ANS, autonomic nervous system, there's going to be something called the sympathetic trunk, which is almost like almost a second spinal cord outside of the regular spinal cord. It's going to regulate your fight or flight response in emergencies, and it feeds adrenaline to the organs and speeds everything up that needs to be sped up, particularly your heart and your breathing. But here is the sympathetic trunk. See how it's almost like a second spinal cord, but it's outside the spinal cord? There is actually one on each side. They only show it on this side. There. On this model, they also show it coming straight down here. The spinal cord, and there's a sympathetic trunk on each side. Torso model, they also show the sympathetic trunk on this side. Or the ANS, not the CNS. All right, let's see where we are now. Turn this page over. All right, we're going to go and look at the spinal reflex arc. And we're going to go into the other room now. How you doing, guys? All right, for the spinal reflex arc, I will show you this picture here first. And have my sheet here, and we have good pictures on the lab study slides, but you can see the spinal reflex arc has 5 parts. It's shown pretty good here. We have the receptor that detects the stimulus, and it's going to send the message along the sensory afferent nerve, which is going to go into the spinal cord through the dorsal root ganglion to the dorsal root. And then the third part of the reflex arc is the interneuron within the spinal cord, within the gray matter, that connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So the motor neuron, motor efferent neuron that's on the ventral, is the fourth part of the reflex arc, comes out, goes out to spinal nerve, which is this little part, going to branch into one of the rami into the plexus, and come all the way out to the fifth part of the reflex arc, which is the muscle. Now, a lot of times this interneuron will send branches up to the brain, but sometimes it'll go straight through, that we don't have to go to the brain. So for certain of these reflexes, testing reflexes, we can test different areas of your body, particularly different muscles, and see if they're connecting in the spinal cord. The most common ones, and I go over this in the lab study slides, patellar tendon extensor reflex, which is the knee-jerk reflex, the Achilles tendon reflex, and the Babinski reflex. Now, we've all had that test done where we somebody taps on our knee and we extend our lower leg out. And just so you can see here the reflex arc, they tap on that patellar tendon here, which stimulates the muscle spindle fiber, or Golgi tendon organ, which is the receptor. Then it sends a message up the sensory neuron into the spinal cord, across the interneuron, out the motor neuron to the quads. Our quads contract and our foot lifts up. All right, and then on the other ones that I have on your list, the Achilles tendon reflex, they would tap on the back of your ankle area or heel area, you know where the Achilles tendon is now. And that's going to send a message up the spinal cord and back out to the gastroc, which is going to contract, pull that area of your foot up, and your foot should go down. The Babinski reflex, maybe I'll show you this at the end. We stroke our foot here, and it should make our toes curl down if that reflex is working, going up the spinal cord and back to the muscle to curl our toes. All right, the last thing we're going to have is the nerve under the microscope. I don't like to show my foot, but maybe I'll show you the Babinski. See, just my foot's dirty from walking around this lap. Anyway, we take this anything here and just stroke it along the lateral and see how it made my toes curl. Yeah, feet are dirty. They need to vacuum this lab. Oh well. All right, so the microscope. Here we have a nerve, and we want to see some of the nerve parts. First, I'll show you the poster we have in the room. Remember, we had the axon of the nerve. We did this on the nerve model, if you remember. We have the axon, and that's going to be wrapped with myelin. And then we're going to have a wrapping around the axon and myelin, which is the endoneurium. All right, I'm going to grab that real quick, so walk with me. My feet are getting dirtier here. But I showed you this model here recently. Here it is. This was the end of the neuron. Remember? We had the axon, the myelin, and the connective tissue covering called the endoneurium. But remember, nerves are hundreds of neurons wrapped together. So, if we take some neurons, this is a microscope picture, magnified 260 times. We look closely, we see an axon, and the white is the myelin, and the purple around it is the endoneurium covering. So we see a whole bunch of these. There's another axon, myelin, endoneurium. You can see there are a whole bunch of them together, and a whole bunch of them are wrapped together. So this wrapping of all the neurons here is called a fascicle. And then we have a whole bunch of fascicles, just like we did in the muscles. Fascicle is a bundle. So fascicle is a bundle of neurons. And then we take a whole bunch of bundles, you can see parts of them here, and we have a nerve. This shows it pretty nicely here on the diagram. This is a nerve, the whole thing. So the whole thing is going to be wrapped with the epineurium. We had epimysium in muscles, epineurium on the nerve, connective tissue covering to hold it together. You can see the fascicles, the bundles of neurons, and each covering of the fascicle is called a perineurium. Peri means around. And then remember, around each neuron, we had a wrapping called the endoneurium. And we can see that pretty nicely on this picture. The other thing I'll try to show you under the microscope, lengthwise, this is one nerve with a whole bunch of neurons, and they're showing the axon parts of it. And you can see where some of the myelin sheaths join there. It's a node of Ranvier, if you remember. But all of these are neurons, and that whole thing is a nerve. All right, let's see if we can see it, and we'll end it here. Well, I don't know how these are going to come out, but I wish we could do this in class because we just focus on that white dot. And this is a lengthwise neurons, and you can see all of them wrapped together there to form a nerve. Each line, I keep losing it here. Each line is a neuron making up a nerve. That was the longitudinal section. For the cross section, see what you can find there. You see the fascicles? The whole thing's a nerve. You see the fascicle bundles? And then you can see the neurons there. Just to prove to you that this is real. Magnified 100 times there. And that's a picture of basically that. Except this isn't showing all the fascicles. But this picture is what you should go by too. That covers it.